It was a dark and foggy night in Ohio, the kind of night where the moon struggled to break through the thick haze, casting a pale light that barely touched the ground. The air was damp, cold, and heavy with the weight of something unspoken, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. As the wind howled through the empty streets, it carried with it an unsettling silence that felt too thick to ignore. There were no sounds of life, no laughter, no footsteps, no vehicles, just the eerie rustling of trees and the occasional creak of old buildings, as if even the town itself were afraid to speak. Everyone knew about the old asylum on the edge of town, but no one dared to talk about it. It stood like a haunted sentinel, looming over the quiet streets. The once grand building, with its towering stone walls and intricate architecture, was now a decaying monument to a past filled with darkness and terror. The windows were shattered, the doors were broken, and vines had started to creep up the walls like nature itself was trying to reclaim the place. Yet, despite its crumbling state, there was something oddly captivating about the asylum, a sort of macabre beauty that beckoned the curious and the brave, while simultaneously sending a cold shiver through those who dared to get too close. For years, the asylum had stood abandoned, but its reputation was anything but forgotten. There was a quiet fear that lingered around the building, one that seeped into the hearts of everyone who lived nearby. The stories about it were never spoken aloud, and if they were, it was in hushed whispers, as if the very mention of it could stir up something dangerous. It was as though the asylum had become a shadow in the town's history, a dark chapter no one wanted to revisit, but could never completely forget. Some people said it was the doctors, the men who wore white coats and held clipboards, that turned the asylum into a place of horrors. These doctors were once the proud pillars of the medical community, celebrated for their brilliance and dedication to helping the suffering. But behind closed doors, far away from the watchful eyes of the public, they began conducting experiments. Experiments that had no place in any ethical medical practice. These experiments weren't meant to heal. They weren't meant to ease suffering. Instead, they were meant to push the boundaries of what was possible, to test the limits of human endurance, and to explore the darkest recesses of the mind. The patients, those poor souls who found themselves trapped within the asylum's cold, unforgiving walls, were nothing more than test subjects to these doctors. Some of them were mentally ill, some were merely misunderstood, and some were just ordinary people who happened to find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. But all of them became part of the cruel and twisted experiments that unfolded in the asylum's decks. No one truly knew what went on behind those walls, but rumors spread like wildfire. The walls of the asylum seemed to whisper their own stories. Stories of pain, fear, and unspeakable acts. It was said that the experiments started out innocently enough, Doctors claimed they were trying to cure mental illnesses, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder. They spoke of new treatments, new therapies that would change the course of medicine forever. But over time, the experiments grew darker. The line between science and madness blurred, and the so-called cures became something far more sinister. There were whispers of brain surgeries performed without consent, of strange injections given to patients, and of the disturbing sounds that echoed through the halls in the dead of night. Some claimed they heard screams, while others said they felt the walls tremble, as if the building itself was alive, reacting to the torment that took place within its confines. There were rumors of one experiment in particular that stood out from the rest, a procedure so vile, so grotesque, that it haunted the nightmares of those who had even heard a hint of it. The doctors, so desperate to find a cure, began experimenting with the human mind itself. They tried to manipulate thoughts, to erase memories, to turn people into blank slates. But the results were nothing short of horrific. Patients became trapped within their own minds, unable to escape the horror that had been unleashed upon them. They would scream for mercy, but the doctors just watched, taking notes, as if their suffering was nothing more than a necessary part of the process. The asylum had become a place of terror, a house of broken souls who had been discarded by society and left to rot in a place where no one would ever find them. The doctors, once revered for their knowledge, were now feared for their cruelty. The experiments they conducted were no longer about curing disease. They were about power, control, and the desire to see just how far they could push the human mind and body before it shattered. And the patients, those poor, unfortunate souls, were nothing more than pawns in their twisted game. As the years passed, the asylum's name became synonymous with fear. It was said that the souls of the patients still lingered there, trapped in an eternal nightmare, unable to escape the horrors they had endured. Some claimed to see shadows moving behind the cracked windows. Others heard whispers in the night. And a few brave souls who ventured too close spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to seep from the very walls of the asylum. It was as if the building itself had absorbed the suffering, the fear, and the madness, and now it was alive with it. The asylum's reputation grew with each passing year, becoming more than just a place of horror. It became a legend, a dark secret that no one in the town would dare confront. People would tell stories about it, but no one would ever go near it. The very thought of stepping foot inside the asylum was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. It was a place where the worst nightmares were born, and where they still lived on, waiting for the next unwitting soul to stumble into their grasp. But despite all the fear, the curiosity remained. There were always those who wondered, who wanted to know the truth behind the asylum's dark past. What had really happened behind those walls? What were the doctors truly doing? And most importantly, were the rumors about the experiments and the suffering true? Or were they just the twisted imaginings of those who had heard the stories and let fear cloud their judgment? No one could say for sure, but one thing was certain. The Ohio Asylum would forever be a place shrouded in mystery, a place where the past refused to die and the horrors of history never truly left. And as long as the building stood, decaying and forgotten, the whispers would continue to haunt the town, a reminder of the unspeakable horrors that once took place within its walls. It was a crisp autumn night when a group of teenagers, driven by their insatiable curiosity and the thrill of the unknown, decided to do what everyone in town whispered about, but never dared to do. They would explore the Ohio Asylum. It had been abandoned for years, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes into the night, and its doors creaked ominously in the wind. Rumors of strange noises and eerie occurrences surrounded the place, making it the perfect setting for their adventure. They had all heard the stories, the screams that echoed through the halls long after the asylum had been shut down, the lights that flickered on their own, and the chilling tales of patients who never left the place alive. With flashlights in hand and the air thick with excitement and fear, they made their way through the dense fog that clung to the ground. The old asylum loomed in the distance, its decaying structure almost swallowed by the overgrown trees and vines that had taken root over the years. As they neared the entrance, their hearts raced, but they pressed on, driven by the desire to uncover the truth behind the ghost stories and to see the infamous asylum for themselves. The air inside was thick with dust, and the musty smell of decay hung in the stagnant air. Every step they took seemed to disturb the silence, the sound of their shoes crunching on the old wood and broken glass echoing in the vast empty halls. The asylum, once a place of fear and suffering, now stood in ruin, its once grand corridors now filled with debris and neglect. The walls were peeling, the ceiling cracked, and the windows were shattered, allowing only the faintest glimpse of the moonlight outside. They ventured deeper into the asylum, their flashlights illuminating the walls as they moved. The place felt alive with history, a history that seemed to pulse with each step they took. They moved cautiously, as if the asylum itself could sense their presence. The eerie silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of the building, as if it were shifting under its own weight, remembering the horrors it had witnessed. The further they went, the more unsettling it became. Every corner seemed to hold a new mystery. Every room felt like it had a secret to reveal. The deeper they went into the asylum's bowels, the more the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows thicker. Then, as they turned a corner, one of the teens, David, suddenly froze. His flashlight flickered for a moment before shining on a small, dusty table at the far end of the hallway. On the table, half buried under a pile of broken papers and debris, was a journal. Its leather cover was torn and faded, but there was something oddly compelling about it. It seemed out of place in the otherwise desolate environment, as though it had been waiting for them, beckoning them to discover its contents. The pages, yellowed and fragile, fluttered in the breeze as they gently approached. David reached out and picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed off the dust. His friends gathered around him, eager to see what they had found. The journal was old, its pages filled with handwritten notes, some of which were barely legible, as if time itself had begun to erase the words. The writing was neat, but had an almost clinical quality to it, a stark contrast to the disarray of the asylum around them. As they flipped through the pages, the entries grew more disturbing. The journal, it seemed, belonged to someone named Dr. James Weatherby, a name none of them had heard before. The first few entries were about routine matters, observations of patients, notes on treatments, and the usual concerns of a medical professional. But as they continued reading, the entries grew darker, more cryptic, and far more sinister. One entry described a series of brain surgeries, procedures that were said to be experimental in nature. The patients, who were listed by number rather than by name, were described as having unexpected responses to the surgeries, their behavior becoming erratic and unpredictable. Dr. Weatherby's handwriting became more frantic as he wrote about his observations. The surgeries, it seemed, were not meant to cure, but to alter the very nature of the mind. The doctor's notes mentioned reprogramming and control, and the entries grew more disturbing with each passing page. The further they read, the more they realized that these experiments were not just unethical, they were monstrous. The journal also contained references to injections of experimental substances, chemicals that were meant to enhance or alter brain function. Some of the patients, the journal noted, seemed to undergo dramatic transformations, becoming almost unrecognizable, their personalities warped and their minds twisted by the substances injected into them. Dr. Weatherby's notes became more chaotic, filled with phrases like Subject 47 showed violent tendencies and Experiment 61 was a failure. Patient had to be restrained. The more they read, the clearer it became that the asylum had been a place of cruelty, a place where patients were nothing more than lab rats in a twisted game of science. The doctor's obsession with his experiments was evident, and it was chilling to see how he viewed the patients, less as human beings and more as objects to be experimented on, dissected, and reprogrammed. But it was one entry, one chilling line that sent a cold shiver down their spines. It was buried deep within the pages, almost hidden amongst the other scribbles, but it was there. Dr. Weatherby had written, Experiment 72, a success, but at what cost? The words hung in the air, their meaning haunting and ambiguous. What had they done to achieve success? And what price had been paid for it? The entry offered no further details, no explanation, only the haunting acknowledgement of a victory that seemed to have come at a terrible cost. The teens sat in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of what they had read sinking in. They looked at each other, unsure of how to react. They had come looking for a thrill, a ghost story to tell around the campfire. But what they had found was far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The asylum was no ordinary haunted building. It was the site of real horrors, experiments that had twisted the minds of those unlucky enough to be trapped inside. They could feel the eyes of the patients, the ghosts of those who had suffered, staring at them from the shadows. The journal had opened a door into a past that should have stayed buried. And now they couldn't unsee the horrors that had once taken place within these walls. As the teens slowly closed the journal, a sense of dread settled over them. They knew they had uncovered something they were never meant to find. And as they looked around the decaying asylum, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The building seemed to shift around them, as if it were alive, as if the horrors of its past were watching, waiting for them to make their next move. They had uncovered the truth, but some truths they realized were better left buried. The teens didn't believe what they were reading at first. They thought it was just the eerie atmosphere of the asylum playing tricks on their minds, making them see horrors where there were none. The journal they had found was disturbing, yes, but they convinced themselves that it was nothing more than the ramblings of a deranged doctor, nothing more than a part of the asylum's twisted history. After all, the place had been abandoned for years. How could any of it be real now? Surely the ghost stories, the whispered legends, were just that, stories. But as they continued exploring the asylum, things started to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in the air, the way the dust seemed to swirl around them unnaturally. Then, as they made their way deeper into the crumbling building, the walls seemed to creak and groan in ways that couldn't be explained. The floorboards under their feet shifted slightly, as though the building itself was alive, breathing with them. It was as if the very foundation of the asylum was remembering its past, remembering the suffering that had taken place within its walls. The weight of the place, the oppressive atmosphere, grew heavier with each step they took. Despite their fear, they continued moving forward, their flashlights illuminating the darkened halls. The building felt vast, its many corridors stretching endlessly into the unknown. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to their skin, and the smell of decay was so thick that it almost made it hard to breathe. But it wasn't just the physical surroundings that began to unsettle them. It was something else, something intangible, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The whispers started softly, just a rustle of air that could have been anything. At first, they thought it was the wind. After all, this was an old building, and it was easy to blame creaks and groans on the natural settling of the structure. But as they ventured deeper into the asylum, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as though the building itself was trying to communicate with them, trying to speak through the very air they breathed. At first, the voices were faint, almost like a low murmur. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, pleading, filled with a sense of desperation. The teens tried to ignore it. They laughed nervously, shaking it off as their imagination running wild. "It's just the wind," David said, his voice cracking slightly. "We're all just freaked out. It's nothing." But as they continued down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more defined and impossible to ignore. The voices were no longer just a faint rustling of air. They were clear, agonizing cries, filled with pain and fear. "Help us," the voices whispered, over and over again. "Help us. They're still here. Don't let them experiment on us." The words sent a chill down their spines, and for the first time, they stopped in their tracks. The whispers echoed off the walls, bouncing around the asylum like a ghostly chorus, each voice adding to the growing sense of terror that gripped their hearts. Mark, the most skeptical of the group, looked around nervously. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The others nodded, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They all heard it. There was no denying it now. The voices were real. The air felt thick with the sound of them, like an invisible presence was watching them, waiting for them to respond. But there was nothing they could do. They stood frozen in place, the realization creeping up on them that they were not alone in the asylum. The ghosts of the past were still here, their cries for help echoing through the decaying halls. The whispers intensified, growing louder and more frantic. "Don't let them do it to us. Please, help." The voices twisted with pain, desperation lacing each word. It felt as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with the torment of the souls who had once been trapped here. The teens' hearts pounded in their chests, their breaths shallow and fast. They were no longer certain if the voices came from the walls or from somewhere far deeper, somewhere darker, more terrifying. Before any of them could react, a sudden movement caught Mark's eye. He turned his head sharply, his eyes scanning the darkness at the end of the hallway. There, just beyond the reach of their flashlights, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form twisted and distorted. For a moment, Mark couldn't even comprehend what he was seeing. The figure wasn't quite human, its shape too elongated, its movements too unnatural. It seemed to melt into the shadows, its edges flickering like a mirage. Its eyes, those eyes, gleamed with a malevolent, otherworldly light, burning through the darkness like twin embers. Mark's blood ran cold. He froze, unable to move, unable to speak. His body went stiff with fear, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get out of the asylum before whatever this thing was could get to him. But his legs wouldn't move. His eyes remained locked on the figure at the end of the hall, as though some unseen force had a grip on him, holding him in place. The others didn't see it at first. They were still caught up in the horror of the whispers, the agony of the voices surrounding them. But Mark's expression said it all. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with terror, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. His body was shaking as he slowly backed away from the figure, his eyes never leaving it. "Mark?" David asked, his voice trembling. "What's wrong?" Mark's eyes flickered to his friends for just a moment before returning to the end of the hallway. "There's something there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I saw it." The others turned, their flashlights shaking in their hands as they scanned the hallway. But by the time they looked back, the figure was gone. There was nothing there but the shadows, stretching long and thin across the cracked walls of the asylum. The whispers had stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed even worse than the voices. They all stood there, breathing heavily, staring into the darkness. Was it real? Was it just a trick of the light? Mark didn't know, but he could feel the presence of something in the air. Something ancient and evil that had been waiting for them. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and the sweat that had formed on his brow seemed to freeze in the cold, stagnant air. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained frozen, his feet rooted to the spot. They all tried to shake it off, telling themselves it was nothing more than an illusion. They had been in the asylum for too long. Their minds were playing tricks on them. But deep down, each of them knew what they had seen. They had felt it. The presence. The eyes that had watched them from the shadows. As they turned to leave, the fear still heavy in their chests, none of them spoke. No one dared to break the silence, as if doing so would shatter the fragile illusion of safety that had settled over them. They moved quickly through the asylum, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them, the memory of the figure and the whispers lingering in their minds. Whatever had been waiting for them in the darkness wasn't done. It had shown itself, and they knew it would be waiting for them again. Terrified but determined, the group pressed forward. Their minds were racing, trying to make sense of everything they had uncovered so far. The asylum was more than just an abandoned building. It was a tomb filled with secrets, horrors long buried beneath layers of dust and decay. They had already encountered more than they'd bargained for. Whispers from unseen voices, a shadow that defied logic, and a journal that revealed a medical nightmare. But they couldn't stop now. Their curiosity, driven by both fear and the need to uncover the truth, pushed them further into the bowels of the asylum. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the building became. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the musty scent of mildew, rotting wood, and something darker, something more pungent. The walls, once white and pristine, were now covered in layers of grime, their surfaces marred with the passage of time. The temperature seemed to drop, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to stumble upon the next piece of the puzzle. The faint light from their flashlights flickered in the shadows, casting eerie shapes that seemed to move with them, as if the darkness was alive and aware of their every move. As they moved down a long, dimly lit hallway, they came across a series of rooms that appeared to have once been offices or treatment rooms. The door to each room was half open, creaking on its hinges, and the floor was littered with broken glass and old papers. The walls of one room were lined with old medical records, some of them yellowed with age, others still strangely intact. These records, most of them written in neat, professional handwriting, chronicled the history of the asylum's patients, names, dates, and details of procedures. But the more they read, the more disturbing the records became. The names of patients, once treated with care, were now barely legible, smeared by time or blood, as if someone had tried to erase their existence altogether. Some of the records listed patients who had undergone bizarre surgeries, procedures that made no sense, brain operations, injections of strange substances, and experiments with little regard for the consequences. The notes were filled with clinical terms that meant little to the teens, but the implications were clear. These were not the kinds of treatments one would expect from a legitimate medical facility. As they flipped through the papers, they came across names crossed out in red ink, patients who were marked as disappeared. The red ink almost seemed to bleed through the paper, as though the asylum itself had witnessed their vanishing, a silent witness to their fate. One of the teens, Emily, shivered as she held up a particular record. "Look at this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This patient, they were last seen undergoing surgery, but there's no mention of them after that. Just this line, 'Subject failed, results inconclusive.'" Her voice faltered as she looked at the others. What happened to them? The others exchanged uneasy glances. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. It was becoming impossible to ignore the chilling reality of the place they had entered. This was no ordinary hospital or asylum. It was a place where the rules of medicine, morality, and humanity had been abandoned in favor of dark experiments, testing the limits of the human mind and body without care or concern. But it wasn't until they reached the end of the hallway that the full horror revealed itself. At the far end of the corridor, partially hidden behind a pile of rubble and broken furniture, was a door. It was smaller than the others, its wood warped and cracked with age. The handle was rusted, but it still turned easily in Emily's hand as she pulled it open. The door creaked loudly, as if protesting the intrusion, but it revealed a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be the basement. The air was thick with a foul stench, a smell so overpowering that it almost made them gag. It was a mix of decaying flesh, something metallic, and the sour tang of old blood. The teens hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold, but their curiosity was stronger than their fear. They had to know what was hidden beneath the asylum. What horrors had been buried here for so long. One by one, they descended the stairs, the beam of their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a large, open space. The basement was far bigger than they had imagined. It was an old operating theater, its walls covered in dark stains, some of them so old and thick that they had turned a deep shade of brown, others still wet, as though they had never truly dried. The room smelled of rot, a heavy, suffocating odor that seemed to seep into their very lungs. The stone floor was cold, and the air felt damp and oppressive. In the center of the room, there was a surgical table. It was rusty, covered in cobwebs, but unmistakably used. Its metal surface gleamed dully in the weak light from their flashlights. The teens approached it cautiously, their hearts racing. It looked like something out of a nightmare, old, bloodstained, and surrounded by rusted medical tools scattered haphazardly on the floor. A scalpel, a pair of forceps, and a syringe lay half buried in dust and dirt, evidence of the terrible things that had once occurred here. Mark, who had been trying to keep his composure, felt his stomach lurch. He stepped closer to the table, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The cold metal seemed to radiate an eerie presence, as though it had absorbed the suffering that had been inflicted here. His breath caught in his throat as he glanced at the walls around them, where faint, almost imperceptible outlines of what seemed to be handprints and smudges of blood were visible. The bloodstains were fresh enough to be disturbing, but old enough to have seeped into the stone, staining it permanently. The teens stood there, frozen, staring at the table, as the realization of what they were seeing began to sink in. This was where the real horrors had taken place. The experiments, the surgeries, the tests, they had all been carried out in this very room. The screams of the patients, the cries for mercy, the frantic pleas for help, they had echoed through these walls, but no one had come to save them. The building had been their tomb, and now it seemed to be theirs as well. Emily gasped, stepping back, her foot brushing against something on the floor. She looked down to see a torn and bloody piece of cloth, a hospital gown. It was stained with dark patches of blood, and the fabric was shredded in places, as though it had been violently ripped apart. Her stomach turned as she realized that this was evidence of the final moments of one of the patients. The thought was too much to bear, and she stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. "How many?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. "How many people did they do this to? How many innocent lives?" Before anyone could respond, a sudden sound broke the oppressive silence, a faint, muffled scraping noise coming from somewhere deeper within the basement. It was slow, deliberate, like something dragging along the floor. The teens exchanged terrified looks, their bodies tense with fear. Was it just their minds playing tricks on them? Or was there something else down here? Something they weren't meant to see? The scraping noise grew louder, closer, and with it came a new sound, a low, guttural groan. The air grew colder, and the light from their flashlights flickered erratically. The feeling of dread, the sensation that they were being watched, intensified. The basement seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it had never truly been abandoned. Something was stirring in the shadows. Something old. Something hungry. The teens didn't wait to find out what it was. In a frantic panic, they turned and bolted toward the stairs, their footsteps pounding on the stone floor. The scraping noise followed them, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. They didn't dare look back. The horrors they had uncovered in the basement were enough. They had to get out. They had to escape before whatever was lurking in the darkness found them first. But as they ran, the basement door slammed shut behind them, the heavy thud echoing through the asylum like the final warning of a place that would never let them leave. The teens had barely caught their breath after the terrifying experience in the basement. As they staggered away from the door that had slammed shut behind them, their minds were still reeling from what they had uncovered. They had found the surgical table, the bloodstains, and the tools of torture that had been left behind as a grim testament to the horrors of the past. But what haunted them the most was the scraping sound that had followed them. Something, or someone, still stirred in the basement, and it wasn't just the remnants of the asylum's forgotten past. It was as if the building itself was alive, waiting for them to make a mistake, to wander too far into its depths. The air outside the basement was no better. The atmosphere inside the asylum had become suffocating, thick with the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting, always present. The whispers, those faint sounds they had heard before, had returned. But now they weren't just whispers. They were voices, real, desperate voices, as though they were coming from the walls themselves, echoing in their heads, reverberating with the anguish of those who had suffered there. The teens glanced at each other, their hearts racing, their minds frantic. But when they turned to face the source of the voices, there was nothing but emptiness. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not just the wind, is it?" David nodded, his face pale. "No, it's them." At first, the voices were so faint, so far away, that they could convince themselves it was all in their heads. But soon, they grew clearer, more defined. "Help us," came the faintest whisper. And then another voice joined in, louder this time. "Don't let them do it again." The voices echoed from every direction, from the walls, the floors, the very air around them. It wasn't just one voice now. It was many, all crying out in agony. Then, just as the tension was reaching its peak, the shadows in the hallway began to shift. At first, the teens thought it was just their minds playing tricks, the darkness bending and twisting as they tried to make sense of the overwhelming fear that was beginning to consume them. But the shadows didn't disappear. They lingered, growing more solid, more defined. At first, they were just flickers at the edge of their vision, figures that seemed to be there one second and gone the next. But as the seconds passed, the shadows began to take form. One by one, the ghosts of the past started to materialize. The first figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. It was a pale silhouette, almost too faint to make out. But as the teens watched, it began to grow clearer. The figure was a woman, her body twisted, her face contorted in pain. She was gaunt, skin stretched tight over her bones, and her eyes, empty, hollow, stared straight through them, as if she could see into their souls. She was one of the patients, the forgotten ones, whose name had been erased from the records, her suffering buried beneath the weight of time. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only the gaping void of her scream remained, a hollow echo that filled the space around them. Another figure stepped forward, this time a man, his body shredded, as though he had been torn apart. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and his face was barely recognizable, the skin hanging off his skull like melted wax. His eyes were wild, crazed, as if they still remembered the agony of whatever had been done to him. His mouth moved, but the words he spoke were indecipherable, an incoherent mumble that blended with the other voices. Yet somehow the message was clear. They were not at rest. They were not forgotten. They were still trapped, still tormented by the horrors that had been inflicted upon them. The ghosts grew more numerous, each more horrific than the last, as though the asylum's tortured past was rising to the surface, refusing to stay hidden any longer. Some of the figures were only partially visible, their bodies nothing but shadows of what they had once been. Others were whole, though disfigured beyond recognition. A man with no eyes, his face frozen in a permanent scream. A woman with one arm missing, her body bent and broken in a way that made it clear she had never walked again. Each ghost had a story, a life that had been shattered in this place, a life that had been erased by the experiments, the tortures, the endless suffering. The teens stood frozen in terror, their eyes locked on the ghosts as they began to move toward them. The temperature in the hallway dropped, and the air seemed to grow thick with the presence of the spirits, as if the very walls of the asylum were absorbing the horror and feeding off their fear. The shadows stretched longer and longer, and the figures of the ghosts began to approach, their arms reaching out toward the teens, their faces twisted in agony. They were trapped in an endless loop of suffering, forever bound to the place where their pain had begun. But it wasn't until one particular ghost stepped forward that the full weight of the asylum's torment became clear. She was a young woman, no older than Emily, her face pale and drawn, her features gaunt and hollow. Her eyes, however, were the most striking. They were wide, filled with terror, as though she had seen something so terrible, so unthinkable, that it had shattered her very soul. Her clothes were torn and ragged, stained with something that looked like blood. As she stepped closer, she reached out toward the teens, her hand shaking. "They never left," the ghost whispered in a raspy voice, her words barely audible, but carrying an unbearable weight. "They're still here, and now they want you." The teens could feel the chill of her presence, the air around them thick with the weight of her words. It was as if the room had gone still, the very air holding its breath. The ghost's voice echoed in their heads, sending a wave of terror through them, filling them with a sense of dread they couldn't shake. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the figure of the woman moved closer, her eyes never leaving them. "What do you mean?" Mark finally managed to whisper, his voice trembling. He didn't know if he was speaking to the ghost or to himself. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes widened even further, the terror in them almost too much to bear. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out this time, only a hollow, guttural sound that sent shivers down their spines. The air was thick with the sound of 1,000 voices, all crying out, all begging for release. But the woman's message was clear. The ghosts of the asylum's past were still here, still trapped in their endless suffering, and they wanted the teens to join them, to be a part of the never-ending torment. As the woman's figure began to fade into the darkness, the temperature in the room plummeted even further, and the sounds of the ghosts grew louder. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows shifting and contorting around them, as though the asylum itself was alive, its very foundation steeped in the agony of those who had suffered here. The teens stumbled backward, their hearts racing, their breaths shallow. They couldn't move fast enough, couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in on them, that the ghosts were coming for them. With a final echoing wail, the ghosts vanished, leaving the teens standing in the cold silence of the asylum. But the damage had been done. The terror, the fear, the realization that they were not alone had taken root in their hearts. They had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? The ghosts had shown themselves, and the asylum's dark, twisted history was now a part of them. As they fled the building, the sounds of the whispers and cries followed them, haunting their every step. They couldn't escape what they had uncovered. They couldn't escape the ghosts of the past. The teens bolted through the asylum's halls, their hearts pounding like a drum in their chests, as their breath came in short, frantic gasps. Panic gripped them, and they could hardly think, only run. The ghosts' agonizing wails still echoed in their minds, and the image of the twisted figures, their hollow eyes reaching out, haunted their every step. The building felt alive, and its presence loomed over them as if it were feeding off their fear. The asylum was not just a place, it was something darker, something far more sinister. And now, it was playing with them, manipulating their every move, determined to trap them here forever. It turned a corner, but the hallway seemed to stretch out impossibly, leading them back to where they had started. They skidded to a halt, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. How could they have come back here? They hadn't taken the same path. The asylum was shifting, twisting its hallways into impossible shapes, playing with the teens like mice in a maze. The walls seemed to close in on them, as if the building itself was shrinking, tightening its grip. Slowly but surely. "Where are we?" Emily gasped, her voice trembling as she scanned the now familiar decaying hallway around her. David, who had been leading the group, stopped and looked behind them, then ahead. His face was pale, his lips barely moving as he whispered, "This doesn't make sense. We're running in circles." Mark looked down the hallway in disbelief. No way. This place is changing. The air felt thick with something unseen, something unnatural. The building's silence, once oppressive, had now become a twisted game. The teens had crossed into something beyond the physical realm, something that defied logic. The asylum was alive, and it was playing with them, deliberately confusing them, guiding them toward nowhere. The walls seemed to pulse, their cracks widening like dark veins. The floors groaned beneath their feet, as though the building were breathing, inhaling their fear and exhaling despair. They turned to run back, only to find that the exit they had just passed was now blocked, an iron gate where there had been nothing moments before. The hallway seemed to elongate, growing longer with each step they took. They were trapped. The asylum had them. "No, we can't stay here," Emily screamed, her voice shrill as panic overtook her. "We have to get out. We have to—" Before she could finish, a loud, low growl rumbled from the darkness, vibrating through the floorboards beneath their feet. The sound was not just an echo. It was something alive, something primal that lurked in the walls, waiting for them to falter. The teens froze, their eyes scanning the shadows, their hearts hammering in their chests. Something was watching them, something far worse than just the ghosts. Mark felt a cold sweat trickle down his neck. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and the walls seemed to lean in toward them. It was as if the building was aware of their fear and was feeding on it, pulling them deeper into its clutches. Their legs screamed with exhaustion, but they had no choice but to keep moving. If they didn't, the building would swallow them whole. They could feel it, feel the building's hunger, its insatiable need for their terror. Emily grabbed David's arm, her fingers tight around his sleeve. "We need to find another way out." Her eyes darted wildly from one end of the hallway to the other. Now, without hesitation, the group ran down another corridor, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. They could hear the scraping of something, like claws against the stone floor, getting closer and closer. It sounded like something was following them, its presence drawing nearer with every turn. They dared not look back. Their only focus now was escape. At last, they reached a window at the end of the corridor. It was their only chance. The window was old, its frame cracked, but it was open enough to climb through. The air outside was thick with fog, but it was their only way out of the nightmare. That was the asylum. Without a word, Mark was the first to scramble toward the window, pushing the broken frame open with all the strength he could muster. His hands were slick with sweat as he hoisted himself up, his heart racing, the sound of scraping claws behind him sending a fresh surge of adrenaline through his veins. One by one, the teens followed, scrambling through the narrow opening and into the cold night air outside. As they hit the ground, They didn't stop to look around or take a breath. They just ran. They ran through the thick fog, through the empty, abandoned streets, not daring to slow down. The asylum was behind them now, its silhouette fading into the darkness, but its presence still clung to them, like a shadow they couldn't shake. But even as they ran, the footsteps behind them didn't stop. They could still hear them, the slow, deliberate pace of someone or something following them in the distance. Every few steps, they turned their heads, expecting to see something chasing them. But there was nothing there. Still, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder, closer. "Stop!" Emily shouted, stopping dead in her tracks, her chest heaving. "We can't outrun it like this." David turned, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not real! It's not real! It can't be!" he muttered, but his voice quivered with doubt. But Emily was already backing away, her eyes darting around, as though she could see something the others couldn't. "No, it's still following us. I can hear it. I can feel it." Her hands were trembling, her voice cracking with the strain of trying to stay calm. They were all shaking now, the cold air mixing with the terror that had taken root in their hearts. They couldn't escape it. No matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they went, the asylum and the horrors inside it would follow them. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. For a split second, everything was silent. The teens stood still, their hearts racing, waiting for something to happen. But the silence stretched on, suffocating them, until they couldn't bear it any longer. "Do you hear that?" David asked, his voice barely audible. The others strained their ears, but all they could hear was the steady beat of their own hearts, drumming in their ears. There were no more footsteps, no more whispers. But then they heard it. A soft, eerie sound that seemed to rise from the ground itself, as if the air around them was alive. A whisper, just faint enough that they could almost convince themselves they hadn't heard it. But then it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't human. It was the sound of something ancient, something forgotten, reaching out from the abyss of the asylum's history. It was a call, a low, hungry whisper, drawing them back toward the darkness, toward the place they had just escaped from. And then, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The earth seemed to shift, like the asylum was calling them back, ready to consume them once more. In the distance, they could just make out the faint, flickering light of the asylum, standing like a dark sentinel, waiting for them to return. The teens ran again, their legs burning with exhaustion, but they didn't dare stop. They could feel the weight of the asylum's presence behind them, pressing down on their shoulders, pulling at their very souls. No matter how far they ran, no matter how much time passed, they knew one thing for sure. The ghosts of the Ohio Asylum would never let them go. The asylum would never let them leave. And no matter where they went, the horrors would follow.